Good afternoon. Konnichiwa. Welcome, everybody. On behalf of the European Policy Centre, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to today's EU-Japan Economic Security Dialogue. This is an important discussion. It's part of our long-standing cooperation with the mission of Japan to the EU, and we're very honoured to have His Excellency here, Ambassador Aikawa, and his team. Welcome to you, Your Excellency. This dialogue builds on our ongoing work and project on economic security, led by my colleagues Georg and Pavel, who you will hear from later in this discussion. This policy dialogue is also made possible by the efforts of the Europe in the World and Europe's political economy programs. With economic security playing an increasingly prominent role in global and EU policy making, it is more important than ever to maintain a close dialogue with like-minded partners. And Japan is definitely a like-minded partner and has been for many, many years. As they pursue economic security, both sides can expect challenges ahead, but also opportunities for exchanging knowledge and strengthening cooperation in this area and many others. Thanks to our excellent lineup of speakers today, is one of the opportunities we have. Thank you again, all of you, for coming. It's good to see such a packed room. And I would now like to give the floor to the Ambassador for his opening remarks. Please, Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. My apologies for being late. My name is Kazutoshi Aikawa. That I just quite new here. I just landed here a couple of months ago, and I really, trying to adjust myself to everything in Belgium and Brussels, and so far so good. I accept the weather, but I thank you for inviting me today, and my thanks go to the EPC. European Policy Center for its initiative in taking up this very timely topic and providing a venue for an interactive discussions. Indeed, economic security is a buzzword, so-called, in today's global policy conversations. And depending on the context in which it is discussed, economic security can mean resiliency, de-risking, strategic autonomy, or that may include other implications. In Japan, there is a broad consensus for the need to enhance our national security through economic policy measures. Security and economy cannot, and I think should not, be separated in addressing today's geopolitical challenges. Particularly, this is quite crucial against this increasing competitive environment of technological innovation. Economic security, however, is not a newly created concept. More than 10 years ago, for example, my big neighbor, China, abruptly introduced export restrictions on the rare earth materials against Japan. And it was a wake-up call to Japanese policymakers on the risks of over-dependency in such areas as critical raw materials. We also saw significant supply chain disruptions during the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. One of the important lessons learned from those past experiences is that there is an urgent need to create a more resilient economy with a robust, durable supply chains. In protecting and promoting economic security, Japan has taken concrete steps over the past few years. 4 years ago, we created an economic team within a National Security Secretariat of the Prime Minister's Office, serving as a headquarters of economic security policies. 2 years ago, we also enacted the Economic Security Promotion Act. We continue to update and implement various relevant measures, including, among others, financial support for critical technologies, and strengthened export and investment controls. In promoting economic security, the partnership among like-minded countries is also a very important driver. We need to learn from each other, to share information, and coordinate our policies to address and counter relevant risks. This is why Prime Minister Kishida led discussions on economic security at last year's G7 Hiroshima Summit meeting, as well as last year's Japan-EU Summit meetings. A cooperation between Japan and the European Union is needed now more than ever. So faced with today's geopolitical and economic challenges, Japan and the European Union, based on shared fundamental values and principles, are taking a similar approach toward economic security. European Union's 3 pillars of economic security measures, namely to promote, to protect, and to partner, with a country-agnostic approach and principles of proportionality and precision, are something Japan can fully support. In addition, Japan and the European Union are of the view that our economic security policy measures should be in line with international rules and commitments. Interactions and engagement between us are becoming more and more intensive and tangible. We concluded, for example, memorandum of cooperation on semiconductors, establishing an early warning mechanism for the semiconductor supply chain and promoting R&D cooperation. We now see the collaboration between Rapidus, a Japanese semiconductor manufacturer, and IMEC, a Belgian nano electronics R&D hub. We are also reinforcing our cooperation on critical raw material supply chains based on the administrative arrangements between the Commission, European Commission, and Japanese Organization for Metals and Energy Security. We call it JOGMEC. We further consolidate and advance such cooperation in other areas as well. In pursuing the security, the partnership with business and academia is a key. The government cannot address the challenges by themselves alone. We thus need to strengthen our engagement with those stakeholders in business and academia as we go forward. Today's event offers a wonderful opportunity to exchange views and deepen our cooperation, bringing together insights from various experts. Once again, I appreciate the EPC for all the efforts in organizing this event. So I look forward to a very interactive discussions in the rest of this seminar. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for these opening remarks, important and insightful, many of which, if not all, we will be picking up in our discussion. And with this, I would like to give the microphone to my colleague, Pavel Svoboda, who is going to be moderating today's discussion. So thank you again, and welcome to everybody for joining our discussion.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and thank you, Ambassador, for already giving us what I thought was a keynote speech, in which you covered the main elements of EU-Japan collaboration as it is. And this panel will now look more in depth at where we are coming from, what problems we aim to address, and what are the mechanisms in Japan and in the European Union, what we can learn from each other, where we can build synergies. That's the objective of today. As Amanda mentioned earlier, this work builds not only on the excellent EU-Japan collaboration, which we pursue at the EPC, but also on the economic security project, which is of strategic importance to our organization this year. We pursue it with a number of partners, and we look into a range of policy areas as part of it. So I would like to invite now the speakers to join me on stage. So Professor Aki Tonami, from the Institute of Business Science at the University of Tsukuba, Professor Akira Igata, from the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology at University of Tokyo. Eva Valle Lagares from the European Commission, head of unit at DigiTrade, and former head of trade at our EU mission to China. Joining us online, Ramana Blahutin, who is Distinguished Fellow for Geostrategy at the German Marshall Fund. And last but definitely not least, our own Georg Rikeles, Associate Director at DPC and co-leads together with me of the Economic Security Project. So warm welcome. What I would like to do now is to invite the speakers to give us 5 to 6 minute long introductions in the first round, starting with the Japanese perspective, if we could, because what we would like to learn more about is, I mean, Japan has been the shining light on economic security for a number of years now. You have definitely been in the leadership position on the subject. You have pioneered many approaches as well. But what we would like to understand better is, well, what are the key considerations? What is the risk assessment that Japan is pursuing? How that has evolved? And how have the different mechanisms, and the ambassador already alluded to quite a few of them, how have they worked in the recent couple of years? So I would like to start with Tonami-san, if you could take us through the main dimensions of Japan's economic security paradigm.
Sure. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you again for this invitation to the workshop. I'm thrilled to be here. Just to explain, I'm actually surprised. I'm invited on economic security matters. I was working at the University of Copenhagen until 2016, and there I had worked on the Arctic governance issue, and we also had a research project to analyze China's involvement in the Arctic region, and particularly using economic tools such as investment. So compared to then, I'm surprised how the discussion in Europe has developed since then. And so with that understanding, I suppose the elephant in the room here is China. I just wanted to explain, given that I work now at an MBA program in Japan with working people, with their kind of experience of working on this economic security issue. For lots of Japanese businesses, economic security goes beyond this US-China rivalry or China's sort of economic dominance in many of the areas. And I would like to also emphasize that the so-called the Brussels effect, that's the process of unilateral regulatory globalization caused by the EU, de facto externalizing its laws outside its borders through market mechanism. So for Japanese businesses, they have been sort of caught in between of the US-led this kind of let's say, which technology should be more prominent, or with dominance over a particular technology vis-a-vis China, and how to correspond to various sort of de facto legal requirements coming from EU, such as GDPR, GMA, GDA. And lastly, there's another element, which is the cross-border economic security, like business and human rights or labor rights, which is mostly led by international organizations like the UN, ILO, or OECD. So, and with the, I'm sorry to say this, but with the Japanese government taking very much laissez-faire approach to, okay, you businesses figure out what to do. And given that it's mostly the small and medium enterprises that need to basically correspond on a day-to-day business operation, they suffer from institutional capacity. And perhaps that's one area in terms of further cooperation with EU and Japan. That's that kind of very, very maybe perhaps boring but practical day-to-day understanding of operation of what it is to implement this new framework of economic security that also includes this Brussels effect, how to respond to the Brussels effect, or to do with global comprehensive security framework. So with that, that would be it. I very much look forward to today's discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So you pointed out that the economic security paradigm is not emerging in isolation. We have certain regulatory frameworks in Japan and in Europe to contend with. And this paradigm needs to be part and parcel of those regulatory regimes as well. So I'd like to go now to Igata-san with a question and a request. If you could, well, try to tell us a little bit about how you see the Japanese and the European economic security doctrines, shall we call them already? Maybe not yet, but they are emerging doctrines. How do they compare? And what lessons we can draw from each other, and how they impact global governance as well?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Akira Igata from University of Tokyo. I've been working on the issues of economic security for about 7-8 years now. I like to think I'm probably one of the first Japanese professors to teach a class called economic security. So I've been in the field for, once again, 6-7 years, 7-8 years. That's not long, but given the fact that the concept itself has really become mainstream in the last 2-3 years, I like to think I'm one of the old ones. Once again, I'd like to thank the European Policy Center for flying me in from Tokyo. I know these aren't easy, so thank you so much to all of the organizers. So given the fact that Ambassador Aikawa and Professor Tonami has already given a great overview of what Japan is already doing, perhaps I can talk a little bit about how Japan and EU can collaborate with each other in the future. And given that I only have 5 minutes, let me just limit myself to 3 issues. And I think through my answers, I'll be answering partly what you asked me about, which is the comparison between Japan and the EU, what that has on global governance and so on. So the first issue I want to talk about is collaboration on outbound investment screening. I can already see some of the diplomats going, because this is a big issue that we know it's coming, right? It's like a tidal wave. Once the earthquake comes, you know that the wave is coming. And at the moment, I think we're all bracing for the impact. What is outbound investment screening? Of course, internal investment screening is to make sure that other countries don't buy our sensitive technologies and companies. Outbound investment screening mechanism is to make sure that we do not fund the enemy's development of critical and emerging technology by investing in these certain companies and countries. Is this feasible? Maybe 3-4 years ago, the discussion was, there's no way we're going to be engaging in outbound investment screening. Now the discussion is, how far will this go? Because as I'm sure many of the audience members know, since you're all interested in economic security issues, the US has already started moving in this direction by providing an executive order saying that if you're trying to invest in China's semiconductor companies, AI companies, or quantum-related companies, you either have to report to the government that you're investing in it, or you're just banned from investing at all. And this brings an interesting issue. If you look at the issue of the semiconductor manufacturing equipment export control against China between US, Japan, and the Netherlands, I think it's fair to say that there was probably some level of pressure from the US government against Japan and the Dutch to make sure that we follow them. Because if it's the US that only engages in export control, then the Japanese company and the Dutch companies are going to make a fortune. And it's not effective unless all 3 countries collaborate with each other, at least in the short term. In the longer term, there's an economic case to be made for a joint export control on SMEs. And I see a similar trend in outbound investment screening. I mean, if it's the US companies that decide, yes, we're not going to be investing in semiconductors or AI or quantum, and in the future, I think this is going to expand to biotech and drones and other areas of critical and emerging technologies, then the Japanese companies, the British companies, the European companies will just invest in them, and it'll be just the US companies that are going to be losing. So we know this is happening. But the US hasn't really decided on how far they want to go with this, which means that I think that there is an opportunity for Japan and the EU to start an engagement, a discussion on how far are we ready to go with the US and how are we going to, in a way, pressure the US to say, we'll do it up to this point, but this is the red line, right? So that's one thing. Related to this outbound investment screening mechanism is perhaps the fact about the linkage between outbound investment screening mechanism and export control. Because if you look at the reasons, the goals of why we're doing both of these, it's to make sure that we don't get these critical and emerging technologies of other countries to be more advanced than ours. At least that's the goal of the US, right? US has made it clear that they're going to slow the development of critical and emerging technologies in China, period. So if that's the case, then I think we need to be harmonizing the export control regimes of unilaterals, multilaterals with outbound investment screening regime that's going to come. So that's probably issue one. I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to be quick. Issue two, countering economic coercion. Now, there's the anti-coercion instrument from the EU. There's a new platform of, on economic coercion or countering economic coercion that's been announced in the G7 Hiroshima. There are also other statements coming out from Five Eyes countries and Japan. There's some talks in IPEF. I believe there's also some talks in CPTPP about working on countering economic coercion. Great. There's a consensus that we have to do something. I think now it's time to implement some of these. Of course, supply chain diversification is one way, right? If economic coercion doesn't work, then why do it in the first place? But I think there are other potential ways to beef up our deterrence so that we can counter economic coercion. And one area, I mean, I can talk about 6 or 7, but given the time, let me just give one perhaps new idea, which is institutionalization of Japan-EU coordination on boycotts. What is a boycott? I'm sure you've all heard of boycotts before, not buying something for political reasons. Boycott is a play on words. You buy something for political reasons. We've kind of seen this in piecemeal, right? The Chinese stopped buying Taiwanese pineapples. Japanese companies bought all of them, and the Japanese public bought everything in 3 days. Japan is now being coerced economically by its seafood ban from China. You have the US government and the US Army saying, we'll buy all of that. Not all of them, but most of them. You've got the Lithuanians being coerced economically, and the Taiwanese decided to buy Lithuanian whiskey, rum, or one of those special alcohol. So if there's a way to institutionalize this short-term boycotts among like-minded partners, then perhaps this is one way to increase the economic resilience towards economic coercion. Lastly, very quick, my last point, third point, public-private partnership. As Tonami-san mentioned, this private sector is the key stakeholder in countering economic coercion or any of the economic security issues. But at the moment, I think we lack the mechanism within Japan. Well, to some extent, there is a public-private linkage within Japan. I think there is also some coordination happening on the EU side between public sector and the private sector, but there's no cross-discussion between Japan and the EU on with public and private sector coming together to talk about certain issues. And I think it would be critical to have this kind of platform because Japanese companies are worried about EU rules, like Tonami-san said about the Brussels effect, and vice versa. I'm sure that EU companies are worried about what the Japanese are going to do in our market with our export control, with our investment screening, with our subsidies. So there needs to be a platform, a track 1.5 dialogue where we can talk about these issues from both the Japanese side and the EU side. What do we need in order to realize this? First, I think there needs to be a point of contact on the EU side, because on the Japanese side, as Ambassador Aikawa mentioned, we already have the economic division of the National Security Strategy, National Security Secretariat that coordinates all economic security issues. That's a one-stop shop. Who do we have to talk to on the EU government side? I think we're not sure yet. So perhaps creating like a commissioner, special commissioner for economic security issues on the EU side would definitely facilitate not only Japan, EU government level coordination, but also among the private sector as well. Thank you so much.
Super, thank you so much. Lots of points to dwell on already, and we will get back to those. But I would now like to ask Eva to tell us which of the specific collaboration projects you consider most promising, I mean, some of the ongoing were mentioned by the ambassador, the early warning arrangement on semiconductors. Some have just emerged from the earlier speakers. There has been a point that on the EU side, it's not really clear whom to phone. I guess there would be a range of phone numbers to choose from. And indeed, in the next commission, that question is likely to be addressed. We have our own suggestion in the framing paper of the EPC with European Economic Security Councils, a more innovative arrangement which aims to pull together the expertise from the different institutions. I'm not asking you to tell us today, because obviously that will need to be decided by the new leadership that emerges after the elections. But I mean, strategically, which of the areas do you consider most impactful for the EU-Japan collaboration?
I'm afraid I'm going to have to escape from that one, but take note of the proposals that have been made for our next working group and discussions under the high-level economic dialogue that we're thinking, that we're precisely preparing now. But let me zoom out. The last time that I was in this room was in March 2023, when President von der Leyen pronounced her China speech. And I'm very happy to be back. As Ambassador Igata explained, our strategies are country agnostic, but as Professor Tonami also mentioned, China is a bit the elephant in the room that does pose specific concerns about economic security, as also Ambassador Akira very well illustrated with the rare earths export restrictions. So let me zoom out of the specific questions, and I'm very, very grateful that someone is putting specific proposals on the table. It also makes my life easier when looking forward and about how to fill with content our dialogue. But I would like to explain a little bit that dialogue for those that are maybe not as into the file as others. The EU and Japan have been collaborating for a very long time. We opened our first delegation in Tokyo 50 years ago. And this year we have been celebrating our 5 years under the EPA, the Economic Partnership Agreement, which we have also now just complemented with a full discussion on cross-border data flows, building on this concept of data flows with trust, which somehow also links back to economic security. And the area beyond the traditional parts of trade that we have been, of course, cooperating very much on is economic security. This is one area that has been gaining in relevance. Japan being a front runner on the matter, I learned, I've been in charge of China for the last 8 years. So Japan is a new field and a bit of a breath of fresh air. It's a different type of discussion. So I learned that the Japan appointed its first Minister for Economic Security in 2021, and he adopted your Economic Security Strategy 2022, and we have been cooperating ever since on this matter. And the main forum for this is the high-level economic dialogue that has met 3 times in the last 18 months. This is really unheard of. The pace is almost relentless. And at the EU-Japan Summit of July 2023, we commended, the leaders commended this enhanced partnership. And in October 2023, the last high-level economic dialogue created a working group. And we had the first meeting of the working group in January. And this working group is on economic cooperation and policies for building more transparent, resilient, and sustainable supply chains. A very broad concept, and now we have to find ways of filling it with content. Hence, my appreciation for the ideas brought here that I will bring back, and we will discuss a little bit how they can interact with the economic security strategy that the EU has been rolling out since June last year. And where we are now, we are still at the level of identifying the risks and then devising risk mitigating measures. We have launched 4 risk assessments on resilience of supply chains, on physical and cybersecurity of critical infrastructure, technology security, and technology leakage, which is something that really has been very much in the head of our Japanese colleagues. And the one for which DigiTrade, and I am DigiTrade, is responsible for is the weaponization of economic dependencies and economic coercion. And once we have the real overview, then we will be looking into how to devise risk mitigating measures along the three Ps, the promotion, the protect, and the partner, which are the cornerstones of our economic security strategy. I think promotion, maybe because I am DigiTrade, and of course this is not the core of our responsibility, gets less visibility. I think it is the cornerstone of our economic security, is make sure that our economies are competitive and resilient and strong enough. There's a lot of investment that has been going on in that respect, and I think this will be also even more important under the next Commission. The protect part is the one that gets most visibility, particularly because we have just issued a package of protect measures, revising our inward investment screening. We now have learned from the 3 years that we have had the European investment screening in operation and coordinating with member states. So we're trying to plug loopholes, definitely ensure that all member states have an investment screening mechanism and that we cooperate more closely, that it's more transparent and that we work better together. And we have launched reflections about the reform of export controls and maybe the other side of the coin, maybe not, the outbound investment screening. We want to make sure that there's no technology leakage, that the risks are well identified before we take measures that tackle them. And of course, we're going to do that in as narrow as possible manner and as proportional as possible manner, because the EU is a specific animal that is composed of 27 member states. And here we are almost on the verge of the national competences, or competences that we need to respect, but also coordinate and support on the side of the EU member states. So I leave it at that, and I take note of the questions for our next discussions.
Super, thank you very much for that. I would like to press you a little bit on one point, which comes directly from what Igata-san said at the beginning. Namely, the observation was that the US hasn't quite decided how far it wants to go in its own restrictions, and hence there is more space for the EU and Japan to collaborate. Now, in the EU risk assessment, how much is that dimension taken into account? Or if it's not now, how much do you think it should be taken into account in the future? Meaning sort of not just technology leakage, for example, in objective terms, but the real world situation in which there is our super important ally, the United States, that clearly plays a significant, if not disproportionate role in this equation.
Well, security, if we have a concern about security linked to specific technologies, for instance, and the EU has put out a list of critical technologies, the concerns need to be taken into account from regardless of the method of acquisition, transmission, and leakage. So in order to have a comprehensive view, you need to look at into different angles. And I think that is what we all have in the back of our minds. But I'm afraid that I really cannot prejudge the outcome of those discussions and of the questions that were put out on the table. We all also have in the back of our minds where the US may or may not go. I think the discussions on China and the US are going to become harder and harder ahead of the election, because both candidates present themselves as very tough on China. And after the election, it's all a big incognita about how things are going. But the China discussion is not going to go away. I'm afraid the Russia discussion, because again, it would be almost very easy if it were only one country of concern. But there are lots of different angles in different economic relations with different partners that are of concern, and Russia certainly is another one. So I think all of these things are going to stay there. The US direction is something that we're all trying to anticipate in our own little crystal balls, but it's a little bit. It's all unclear, but we do have it in the back of our minds, all of us.
I fully understand, and many thanks for that comment. I suppose the call in between the lines, if I read you correctly, was also to bridge the domestic, the internal, and the external dimension. And that's an excellent segue to Romana, who was for a number of years the EU's connectivity ambassador, and whom I want to ask about that broader geostrategic dimension of what we're talking about here.
Thanks a lot, Pavel, for inviting me. I'm really sorry I'm not with you in Brussels, but at least I have a little bit of sun here down south in Europe. For me, since I started working on this file, I'll just quote you, Japan was a shining light from the very beginning of our thinking on what is happening and how the Chinese Belt and Road has been really completely changing the way the world as we knew it was functioning. And Prime Minister Abe already in 2015, I think, tried to alert everyone to look at this in a far more strategic way. But it was not really possible, I think, until both the pandemic and the Russian attack on Ukraine fast-forwarded everything to an amazing scale. What we started in 2019 with the connectivity partnership with Japan in a very, I would say now, timid way, 2.5 years later looks much more comprehensive. Japanese economic security, European Union economic security, and just listening to the discussions, I think many of these issues were clear already then, but the urgency was not clear and the capacity to respond as well. And as Igata-san said, now we are in a situation to think moving from no way to how far. When we talk about economic security, and I was listening very carefully to all colleagues, it's mostly really about defense in a way, strengthening your base and being able to defend yourself from weaponization of economic relations. It is about strategic autonomy. It is about protection or defense. But what I think is equally important is strategic indispensability. How do we move also in our sort of positioning from thinking equally about defense and offense? And I really find it one of the weakest points, in particular when it comes to the European Union. Our perception of our relations with the global South is still somehow within the development assistance framework. We are still thinking about it through, I would say, institutional, not political brain. And for a very long time, I've tried to advocate what we have to do. We have to move the next step and sit down and have a very sincere comprehensive industrial dialogue with the Global South. We need to have it in partnership with our strategic partners, but also with our private sector. China is a manufacturing giant. That's not going to change. The last figures, I was just reading an analysis this morning, is just growing. And if we want to be able to diversify, we need to support creation of new manufacturing hubs. The most recent numbers on global ODA are 200 billion annually. So 200 billion annually is procured or given through the global ODA. 75% of global ODA is disbursed by G7 countries. Is it time for all of us to sort of sit down and figure with our partners from the Global South how to maybe better use that money, how to better use that money to support creating manufacturing capacity on a much larger scale, how to assist the transfer of knowledge and skills, how to help build strategic infrastructure without which none of this would be possible. Partnership with India, partnership with Southeast Asia, partnership with Africa, with Latin America. For me, I have to say the IMEC corridor, or India, Middle East, Europe corridor, is the first a real sort of grand vision or strategic approach to it, and would be really important to look at this exercise on IMEC and see how best we can utilize a new way of thinking about our ability to project. Also, consolidation of European space along the North-South route. I think I know that Japan has been much more now interested in 3Cs initiative. Of course, there is a pronounced interest on helping with the rebuild of Ukraine once we are in a situation to do that. So to think about this in a far broader, more comprehensive way, and try to imagine it within sort of circles of strength and resilience that we build with our partners. I fully agree that in terms of the European Union, it would be important to have institutionally one brain that deals with this. Is it a econ security commissioner? Is it competitive Europe commissioner? But we need finally one brain that can incorporate both internal and external dimension. The way this is being dealt with until now is just not going to work. And we don't have time. We don't have so many opportunities. We do have money. And I think what we need is to understand that some things really need to change and to act far more with our political brains than with our institutional brains. I'll stop here.
Romana, thank you very much for especially this call for thinking afresh about our relations with the Global South. This is becoming a bit of a recurring theme in our own work on economic security, perhaps somewhat unexpectedly, because it wouldn't be on our initial short list of issues, intensive and busy as it is, mainly due to the fact that there are other more pressing issues, not that it's not important. But clearly, this is of fundamental importance. And I will want to come back to you later in the discussion for some thoughts about how exactly should we go about it. You mentioned some of the partnerships. So is that the formula? And also, how do we create the buy-in politically in Europe? for this type of arrangement. I think we haven't even started to scratch our heads with respect to how to convince our citizens that an arrangement of this nature would be needed. So if you could give it some thought as we now listen to my colleague Georg Rikeles. And I would like to ask Georg about sort of this shifting sand of the global economic and strategic reality, because in order to be pragmatic and concrete on economic security, you need to know exactly what it is that you are trying to solve. And the situation, as the WTO research shows, is that the world is splitting into different blocks, and clearly there is one around the US and the West, and there is one around China. But how much of that can we foretell into the future? What sort of developments do you think we should be seeing in our crystal ball, and how exactly to then try to answer them? Making sure that we answer what is most strategically relevant.
Thank you, Pavel. Those are a couple of difficult questions there, but maybe may I start by saying I'm also very happy to sit on this panel. I think it's been an excellent discussion so far, and very little to disagree with around the table. And of course, one thing that everybody has mentioned is the extent to which Japan has been pioneering economic security, and to the extent to which there's a lot to learn for the EU from what Japan is doing. And I think that is a good thing. Now, sort of coming back to a couple of points of discussions, and also what you just asked, Pavel. Well, I heard Professor Tonami, you said that you were surprised by how far Europe's discussion has developed in this space, and I, in a sense, would say yes and no. Also, partly in answer to the question Pavel just asked. In fact, yes, all the world's trade ministers, or many of them, were recently in Abu Dhabi for the WTO ministerial. And you had one of these Reuters headlines that came out. WTO analysis, the world is splitting into two trade blocks. It's quite a dramatic message that I think we wouldn't have been that ready to accept or acknowledge only a few years back. There's plenty of evidence now coming out. I saw the World Bank was writing about the fact that we have the lowest growth in trade in goods for 50 years, if you take out the big recessions. And just this weekend, I was reading the Financial Times, and of course, this was more of evidence of the anecdotal kind. It was a story about how Chinese consumers are turning their back on Apple iPhones and Tesla electric cars as a matter of in a sense, economic choice, but also in a sense security and national choices. So I think there's a clear understanding here that, in a sense, I think yes, Europe's discussion is picking up, but I think the world is changing perhaps all the more faster, and I think the world is changing very much so faster than we would like it to be doing. You've spoken about the elephant in the room, China. I think there's many elements of fragmentation that one spots now, and of course it's difficult to see exactly where they will head and where perhaps new equilibria will lie. But I do think that this US-China strategic rivalry is something to stay with us, that will stay with us, and in a sense this is a rivalry that is in the process of ratcheting up. So it reaches a level. It goes up and it goes up. It's very difficult to get it back down again. That's the mechanism of a ratchet. And so this is something that seen from Europe, seen from Japan. Surely it's not a situation we've wanted, but I think we have to deal with. There's China, as the ambassador mentioned. I was reading The Economist the other day, a few months back, how China has been holding back exports of graphite to Europe since 2020. It's not only the rare earths, it's not only germanium and gallium, etc. Graphite. And one can ask oneself why. Of course, a benevolent argument one could say is that, of course, China might want to move up in the value chain and export not graphite, but batteries. But there's also this idea that behind this, there might be strategies that consist in holding European fledgling battery chains or developers down. Northvolt, so Europe's champion to be, maybe, is amongst the companies that put up the flag. But so one can imagine there is also a strategy which is about keeping Europe's battery developments down while Chinese actors get international market shares and also foothold in Europe. So this is very much part of this environment we're talking about. And somewhat euphemistically, you also spoke about some level of pressures from the US. I think absolutely that is part of the story going forward. So in a sense, this is a brutal wake up and an element of urgency. In that context, the second point I wanted to make is quite a fundamental one. I think, Romana, you spoke about not only playing defense but also playing offense. Well, I think for Europeans in this context, it's very important that we still manage to think that going beyond our borders can complete our most fundamental goals. It's not a way of saying that we still need to have an open relation towards the world, despite the fact that the world is contracting. We had Martin Sandberg here not so many weeks ago, who was talking about globalization might be reversing, but that doesn't per se have to mean less open trade. It can be a question of diversifying and opening more towards more like-minded partners. And I think really that is a critical topic for us to discuss also between Europe and Japan, because economic security might, in one instance, mean competition for economic security, competition for critical resources. That is not what we want. What we want is economic security to mean cooperation for economic security. And that's the title of this event, but this is not a given. So that's why I think it is very important that in the Commission's communication, I don't think everything is at the level it should be quite yet, but there's a lot of emphasis on partnership. I think that is absolutely essential, and that's also why we need these kind of discussions. And then, not to be too long, the third point I wanted to make was maybe just to point to some of the main challenges at the EU level, and also in comparison to Japan, or making that comparison. I think you were touching upon it, Pavel. I don't think the EU strategic agenda coming later this spring ahead of the summer is ready to really make the choices that are necessary for economic security. It will come as an afterthought. We are not ready to deal with the trade-offs between security, economic security, and competitiveness, and with climate change, and nature preservation, and social acceptability. So I think really this is going to be a very difficult policy space. That's one point. A second point, it has been mentioned, the need for investment. Romana, you did mention that EU has the money. Well, yes and no. I'm not sure we actually have the investment money that's needed today for economic security. I think the coffers, in a sense, are pretty empty right now. I noted that in Japan, when Japan was scaling up its ambitions in economic security in 22-23, well, boom, $8 billion were put on the table to be able to finance what one needs to do. For the time being, economic security at the European level is an idea without the budget, and that can't continue. And of course, the scale of the investments that might be needed or will be needed are much bigger than 8 billion. We are talking about significant new investment capacity that is needed across many dimensions of economic security, and we can come back to that. And the third point, of course, which has been mentioned extensively, is this whole point about institutional capacity. Who do the Japanese dialogue with in Europe, but also how do we organize internally? And there also, I think we need more than just an economic security brain or commissioner at the EU level, at the level of the institutions. I think it's what's needed is more of an institutional underpinning where one has the capacity to work across Commission DGs, but also across Rue de la Loi with the Council, with the External Action Service. And that is why we have started working, and we will do more work on that with Pavel and others on what an Economic Security Council could look like, given the EU somehow sui generis setup. So I think that's also another clearly a big topic for the EU going forward, both to deliver on promote, protect, partnership, but also the whole preparedness and readiness to face this new economic security paradigm. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Georg, and big thanks to all the panelists for this opening round, which I think has already laid out for us what the scale of the challenge is. I would like to bring in any comments or questions from the floor that I can possibly spot. So please signal to me, and I can see immediately two hands going up already. One I expected, the other one too, but both I expected. Let me put it that way. So, but let's start with the voter. I then have a couple of questions of my own to all the speakers, but let's try to be as interactive as we can. Oh, would you like? Oh, yes. Maybe that's a good idea. Let's maybe. Yeah, but it's a good idea to to react to what has been said. Yeah, no, that's true. So if Votary, if you could hold your power. No, but please, I think it's good to have first of all an exchange among the panelists briefly, and then we open up quickly. We still have 50 minutes.
I feel awful. I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but I just felt also compelled to come back to a couple of comments that had been made. First, on the partnerships, because Professor Tonami brought it up, and Romana also brought it up, and I think that this is very, very much something that is under discussion today, also as a means to make the most of the funds available, because there are funds, and I'll get back to that one, but indeed, they are not unlimited. And the best way to make the most of what we have is to partner together. To partner with the private sector, and this is what Professor Tonami said, of course, for the EU is particularly difficult. We don't do trade and investment promotion. This is in the hands of our EU member states, but we do need our industry to embrace, to own, and to carry out our de-risking strategy. Without them, there is no way around this. Also to embrace and to benefit and to really carry out the promote part, the really become more competitive and stronger, more resilient. But also about partnerships with third countries, because obviously when we look for alternative sources of essential supplies, many third countries do not want a larger, let's put it positively, they want a larger share of the pie of the global value added in the supply chain. So they don't just want to provide the raw materials. They want to add value and get some of the economic benefits of the transformation. And I think this is absolutely legitimate. So we need to think new ways in which we can address this legitimate desire for development while addressing also our, I think, legitimate desire for more resilience and varied sources of supplies, and with like-minded, because again, there are many things that we cannot do alone and that we shouldn't do alone, and that those are areas where partnership should address. Then I wanted to address the point of economic security and idea without money. I disagree. Maybe we will never have all the funds that we would like to do. But I do agree with Romana that there are funds available, and a lot of those have been mobilized for the promote part. A lot of funds have been mobilized to deal with the Green Deal, to help our industries in transition, and this is maybe not immediately linked to economic security, but it is about promoting our competitiveness, about having a resilient industry that faces the challenges of today's climate change and carbon transition. So I do think from that perspective, there are funds available. There are also funds available under the Global Gateway, surely never enough. And surely there's a way of again, partnering also with our member states, the EU, this little hybrid issue, to make sure that we all come out as a team Europe, and that we help and create packages that are really more attractive. So there is money. There will never be enough money, and we can never out-subsidize our way out of this one, because democratic, transparent, and accountable regimes have constraints that others do not have. So we will never out-subsidize ourselves out of this, but there is money. There should be more always. And I think also better ways of using it. Sorry.
Yes, thank you so much. That's a super important point about resource allocation, because at the end of the day, this is what it is, right? And in democratic countries, we have no particularly fierce debates over that, to put it mildly, and one is coming up here very soon, or in fact, we are slowly in the middle of it. Igata-san.
Thank you. 3 quick points inspired by George. How do I pronounce your name? George. So you talked about how Chinese consumers are turning away from iPhone and Tesla, and that inspired me to make a comment, because once again, private sector is private sector, right? They act almost independently from the government, but in the case of certain authoritarian countries, that may not be the case. However, I do want to note another interesting opposite development happening in China, which is that if you look at the Chinese companies, it's really interesting. The Chinese are now engaging in a seafood import ban of Japan, and all of the Japanese scallops that used to go to China is stopped, but all of the Japanese scallops that went to elsewhere around the world also stopped, because Japan used to send all of the scallops to Chinese factory first, and then had it deshelled, and then export it to other countries like the US and Europe and elsewhere. And because of this, Japanese government helped, and the US government also helped, to identify certain factories in Taiwan, Southeast Asian countries, so that the Japanese can sell these scallops first to these factories, and then they would deshell it, and they would sell it back to US and EU and elsewhere. So it seems like there's now a supply chain reconstruction happening, right? And then what did these Chinese companies do that used to deshell these scallops in China? They decided to create factories in Vietnam. They're now creating countries in Southeast Asia. So once again, even Chinese companies are economic animals, and there might be a way for us democratic countries to try and capitalize on that, because everyone wants to be rich and happy and fat, right? We want to. So that's one thing. You eat lots of good food, and if you're a little bit fat, then you're happy. Anyways. Second, you talked about the graphites and germanium basically export de facto ban of these critical minerals from China. And this, I want to emphasize how this also points to the fact that we have to start linking the products and finances. I mean, I talked about linking export control and investment screening, and I think we have to also link supply chains and financing, because let's say that China stops selling its germanium to Japan. The Japanese government, Japanese companies are having trouble, and then they were able to buy a new source of germanium from, let's say, Germany. This is great, right? Japan was able to reconstruct its supply chains. No, because this German factory and refinery is 100% owned by Chinese state-owned enterprises. That's not an effective decoupling or diversification, right? So once again, I think there's a need to really link the product supply chains and finance of supply chains. And lastly, you talked about how you don't want competition among the democratic countries. But the difficult part is that you want some healthy competition among the democratic countries too, right? So how do you balance this healthy competition with just a outright competition where we're engaging in, let's say, subsidizing the same things like semiconductors that we seem to be starting to do right now? And once again, I don't have the answers. I think these are the questions that we have to be thinking about when we're engaging in dialogues between Japan and the EU.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Any further? Yes, Tonami-san.
Thank you. So I'm just out of curiosity, how many of you here are from business or industry? Very interesting. So, yeah, so I had a student who's originally from Hong Kong, and she worked for a Japanese company, and she was basically embroiled in this kind of perceived U.S.-Japan rivalry. And then her company, which is a Japanese trading company, was very much caught in it. So she, although it was rather, thank you, sensitive, she conducted personal interviews with Japanese business people in China, working in China, how they perceive this kind of threat. And of course, it very much differs from person to person, but their understanding of a threat is very, very, very different from what we in the policy circle say about a threat. So I think, as Georg mentioned earlier, we really need to understand what is actually going on in China and also with businesses in China. I think there's too much talk about, this. Somebody called it China's threat as an orange threat, because it's a traditional kind of a yellow peril discussion that goes back all the way to 1920s, plus this kind of a fear of the communist regime, which is red. So it's combined together as orange threat. So I would like to ask, because I'm not a security person by training, I would like to, stop and just to pause a little bit. Are we too overwhelmed by this perceived orange threat? That's just a warning, because we could do all the cooperation and partnership, but when we are trying to partnership of non-existent threat, it would be such a waste of time and money. So really, really important to have a cool head and a warm heart. And then I'd like to ask a question to Romana about this, having a dialogue with the Global South and Southeast Asia and India and Latin America. By all means, I think it's a welcome direction, but I'm just out of curiosity. That's the kind of thing Japan has been doing for a very long time. And we've been criticized that combining official development aid with our strategic goals. So I wonder, in terms of political climate here in Europe, is it going to be acceptable for European businesses to have suddenly this kind of intervention from EU? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, may I react to
yes,
that?
Romana, please,
Yeah,
please
great.
react, and then we go to the two questions quickly.
Great. Great start of what I wanted to say. Europe will have to change. And I think what Japan has been doing has been proven right policy. And this is where I think a trouble for the European decision makers will be, because by design, European ODA is non-tied aid. And it's very, very difficult to make non-tied aid strategic. It's almost excluding each other. So I think what we need to do is, first of all, listen to our partners in the Global South. The request is very clear. They want to move up the value chains. It's a completely legitimate, as Eva said, it's a completely legitimate ambition. And we cannot think of economic corridors as just corridors for transport of raw materials, etc. We have to think it in a much, I think, larger way. Nobody wants to fully depend on anyone. The partners, when you talk to colleagues from the Global South, of course, they don't want to depend on China or solely on China, but there is no other choice in terms of scale and speed. So if we want to be able to help build up their growth and their resilience, which in turn helps our growth and our resilience, we have to think about these two dimensions, scale and speed. And for scale, we have to really, and this is something that, again, is a European issue, we need to understand what we are doing here in relationship with the Global South. What we are doing or we want to do here is not development, it is strategic investment, and they want and need strategic investment. And this is where Also, the methodology will be different. You asked me, Pavel, about how to do it. Huh? There are solutions already. There are strategic infrastructure investments fund. There is one functioning very well in India. There is the issue of rebalancing. So I'll just give you figures for the EU. For the last 5-6 years, on average, annually, EU member states and institutions were disbursing around 80 billion ODA. And 40 billion export credits for member states. Maybe we should rebalance. Maybe we should think how this money would work best, because the end is going to be economic development, but maybe the methodology should be different. And then you asked me about how do we create this buy-in in Europe. I have to tell you, from my experience, an absolute vanguard in request for the change was the private sector. It has been private sector pushing us to do something and simply understand the new reality that we are in. And the problem is not, I don't think the problem is with member states at all. The problem is really that we are in a new situation. It requires a paradigm change. Paradigm change on Schuman doesn't come easy. But I think the fact that we will have a new commission is a great opportunity, because, you know, in the EU, things are top down. So if you design the commission in a way and institutions in a way that they capsule certain key issues to be dealt with, then it can trickle down to the system. And this is really an opportunity, and I hope that we will be very pleasantly surprised on how strategic the division of labor is going to be once we know how the new commission will look like. So it's a lot of it. A lot of it is in our minds. Huh? And for the money, finally, there is a difference between having an idea without the budget and having the money. Again, I think there is money, but how you deal with it is something that we need to sit down and see whether it needs change.
Super, thank you so much. I very much hope you're right. I think there's no question that we need this type of change of mindset with respect to the global South, but it's also abundantly clear in this electoral season that the context and the circumstances are particularly demanding for it. So we have to be braced for a tough discussion about this. Now, many thanks to both speakers now who had questions or comments for your patience. Voter, you were first. Maybe there are more questions or comments. Yes, there are. So that's very good. So let's now have a round.
Let me first start by, I will not use football analogies because they seem to be picked up.
Maybe introduce yourself, Voter.
Yeah. So I'm Wouter Ballon from ASML. Using a cinematic reference, I want to give throw in one statement into this group. How I learned to stop worrying about the US and China and love the EU-Japan relationship. I think Igata-san was making a very interesting point. We hear all these governmental and intergovernmental conversations about economic security. What I sense from an industry perspective is that we care less about the economic security conversations, about all the protect measures that are being discussed, and we would much rather like to redesign the conversations. And what I've also noticed, having interacted a lot with the Japanese government, but particularly also with Japanese businesses, that they feel the same. And what I like about the EU and Japan versus the US and China is that there's, in our respective jurisdictions, still room. Because in the United States, it is impossible at this point in time, and in China as well, because there's a big patriotic wind in both countries, which, you know, we suffer a little less from. And then Igata-san made a very important point, is that besides governments speaking to one another, you need to have at the same time, and preferably in the same room, industry involved. And looking at it from a semiconductor and also specifically from a wafer fab equipment perspective, we have immense common strengths. We have identical challenges, which calls particularly in the EU-Japan axis for a lot more work. And last but not least, also building on some of the things that various panelists have been saying, it's about these supply chain reconstructions, which I think what we are all losing sight of is the immense costs. And now, I mean, this morning in the FT, there was a talk about Malaysia, the big winner of supply chain reconstructions. And even though that's great for Malaysia, even though that's great for Vietnam, but ultimately, what good does this do for European businesses and European consumers, or for Japanese businesses and Japanese consumers? Because it's a cost. You move things out of China to other countries in the region, and who says that things become safer or better? So that's still, and I think also, given the fact that we don't have that patriotic wind, at least between the EU and China, we can have, with relatively open minds and ears, have a conversation with one another. So I'm just leaving it there.
Hey, but don't leave it just there, because I wanted to press you a little bit. Can we? You will recover your mic. I wanted to press you a little bit on the first part of what you said, namely that you would like the conversation to be redefined. We've heard what you would like to avoid, but what would you like to front load in that conversation?
Front loading the conversation between the EU and Japan business and governments. I think what is important is we have much stronger coordination on the promote side of things, that we don't duplicate spending on designing out one country or the other, but we think jointly. I mean, the 3G example, graphite, germanium, gallium, similar challenges, and we also don't want to reconstruct and then ultimately feeding the same beast. So this is also where I think we can on the promote side think together about smart spending, not using taxpayers' money on both sides, but collectivize it, because ultimately that also avoids that we start competing with one another.
It makes me think of last year's IMEC forum, since IMEC was also referred to, where Luc van Hove, the CEO, made what I thought was quite a passionate plea for global collaboration in technology development. I mean, IMEC's success story is built part and parcel on global collaboration, right? So in this approach to economic security, one should definitely not forget that we have lots of learnings from each other on which we have to build. And in technology, this is probably true more than anywhere else. So we have, yes, who holds the microphone is now the big question. There are two microphones. So please. No, but okay. Yes, please. So let's travel.
Thank you to the other microphone. Hello, my name is Maud Fichet. I'm also from the European Commission, but from the research side, from DGRTD. And my question, you touched upon it actually, Eva, thanks a lot. You talked about research, technology, and I think I had a few questions, so maybe more directed to the Japanese colleagues and also the PC and Mrs. Vleuten, is where does research lie in this entire discussion? Is it more about these leakages we've talked about? Do you partner at all on research security? Can you? I mean, we talked about the global south, and Mr. Michaelis, you said, the communication was, what did you say? Not mature yet on some aspects. So, what about, does research is a mature aspect of this communication or not? Thank you for your views.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And now we go to the back. Thanks for your patience.
No, is it working? You can hear me? Good. My name is Lars Bruckner. I work for NEC, a Japanese traditional ICT company with a heavy AI focus in the last few years. I'm very happy that the two speakers came in front of me. Actually, the first speaker, I don't have to repeat anything. These were all my points. I was missing the private business aspect to the discussion so far. The only thing maybe I want to add there is, this is probably not only easy in terms of EU-Japan cooperation, because I do not think that within the EU, we have a clear view on how governments and businesses should cooperate on economic security. I think there are different approaches, national government approaches, and maybe also different industry approaches, depending on whether you have a massive industrial background, yes or no, in your country. But okay, the second point, again, also happy that I had a speaker in front of me, because my second main question was really about research and innovation cooperation, and how do we make sure that, especially in the context of EU-Japan cooperation, which has been celebrated, and rightly so, also specifically from a digital partnership perspective, but how do we make sure that we don't eventually still approach it from a competitive economic security perspective, but truly from a cooperative one? Because frankly, a lot of Japanese companies in Europe have the feeling that the EU Commission is really pushing the strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty thinking very strongly, too strongly for our thinking, into research and innovation cooperation. And that for me does not really square with partnership cooperation, specifically digital partnership. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Any further questions or comments in the room for the moment? If not, then let's maybe tackle these two questions in turn, starting with the relationship between business and public authorities of different nature. I'll be curious to hear a little bit more about the Japanese experience, but maybe also some of the speakers can refer us to a best practice on the issue globally, wherever it is. Because it is true to say that it is the economic entities that at the end of the day take these economic decisions, and they need to be well aware of this now evolving context. But they will pay the price or reap the benefits at the end of the day. So that dialogue is essential, but how to exactly organize it remains the question. I don't know who would like to go first. Yes, please. Igata-san.
So it's great that our ASML colleagues are here. We are both partners and I guess victims as well from certain pressure from certain countries. Having said that, we talked about how the US and China is already being blown with patriotic wind, whereas Japan and EU is not. I agree, but I also want to point out that perhaps it's not just the patriotic wind that's forcing all of the private sector in different countries and governments in different countries to take these economic security policies. For instance, there is a genuine security concern, I think, in relying on certain countries like China or Russia for our critical materials. That's why we have seen the clear track record of the use of economic coercion by countries like China and Russia. So I do think that that's a necessary risk that government needs to intervene in. If you look at the long-term interests of the pure economics, for example, at least in Japan, when the discussion over the semiconductor manufacturing equipment export control was proposed, there was actually a long-term economic discussion there as well, in that in the short term, yes, if the US does this and Japan can sell more to China, then Japan would benefit short term. But in the long term, it would actually allow China to indigenize some of these high-end chips, and they would be able to produce this very cheaply because the Chinese government is going to subsidize it. And then they are going to flood the market with high-end chips in the 5 or 6 years later, which would be problematic for all countries, Japan, Dutch, or the US. And there's actually an example of this, right? And it's solar panels. China has been able to do this. And I think there were legitimate concerns among also the industries that this might be the case. So I can see that you're saying, not so much, but that's the way that discussion did happen in Japan is one point. Second, with regards to supply chain reconstruction, I completely agree. There is an immense cost associated with moving supply chains because the factories were in China for a reason, right? It was cheap. They had good labor. It's stable. It was what it was. But now that calculation is changing a little bit. And I think that here, perhaps the EU can learn from how the Japanese government is now dealing with this, which is the Economic Security Promotion Act, or ESPA. They have this small subsidies to nudge these companies that are seeing their calculation change to say, look, if you're thinking about building a new factory somewhere else, then we'll give you 33% or 50% of subsidies if that product is strategically important for Japan. This includes semiconductors, batteries, LNGs, fertilizers, airplane, ships, permanent magnets. So it's really 11 strategic goods that that the Japanese government has identified. But if you're in the supply chain for these 11 strategic goods, then there's a case that you can make to the Japanese government to get maximum of 50% subsidies off of it. And I think that's a significant subsidy. And also, I think it's a good incentive mechanism to say, look, it's in the interest of the private sector to do this as well, because, if you can reduce risk while getting government money, then that's good for you. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Romana has raised her hand online.
Yes, thanks a lot. I think one of the next discussions you should really put a group of private sector colleagues and have a deep dive into what is being discussed at this very moment. I think it's super important. First, I'm not sure that there are patriotic wins only in US and China. And I don't think that's the thing. We will see. European elections are coming soon, so we'll see what kind of winds will flow there. That is going to be an interesting one. There's also structural difference. I mean, US and China are global powers. EU and Japan are very, very, very strong middle powers. It's just a different presence globally. Globally present middle powers. So it's really interesting on the threat perception. I think everyone needs to sort of come to peace with the fact that security is the beginning and the end of a state. The job of state is to keep us all secure. And if for the last 2, 3, 4 decades, we lived in a world where we didn't have to be bothered for choosing between cheap and safe, and we were choosing cheap, that is over. We have entered a security decade, and we have entered to the security decade not of our own choosing. Somebody else decided to start that situation. So I think we all have to get reorganized into what the future holds for us. I could discuss now for ages about the threat perception, but just the fact that digital connectivity has a kinetic dimension, has a dimension that is the core of sort of a security threat, is something that is very different from that it was, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago. So that is, again, I think something that merits a discussion on its own. For the research and innovation are, a cornerstone of our discussion with the Global South, if for nothing else than for the demographics. We are old societies. Japanese society is the oldest society, I think, the average age 47. In European Union, the average age 43. In Africa, the average age 18. There is a pool of talent. There is also knowledge to be shared. But the key here, and this is where it will become complex, for us to be able to have real partnerships on this, we will have to have trust. Just think about artificial intelligence, think about, I don't know, research on genomes or different kind of research. And this trust is always a dividend of a political relationship. And there is a need, really, I think, for us in Europe to sit down and figure out how we want to carry on these partnerships forward. Part of creating this trust with the Global South is creating a situation where they can, with our help, move up the value chain. I think this is how you prove that you are serious and honest in that relationship. So absolutely, innovation for many things is going to be a determined who is going to win, who's going to lose the future in a way, and I think is going to become only more important as we move on.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Romana. It is a conversation on its own to be had about the Global South and convergence models, because what has surely happened on many fronts is that convergence has taken place, many indicators, but income lags behind for a number of reasons, right? And that has to do with the technological convergence above everything else. So not everybody is in the right type of a race for value creation. Any further comments on business versus public and role of research in economic security? Yeah. So I think Georg was a few seconds before Tonami-san,
Well,
but
thank you for that. I thought I'd make 3 comments. One, I hadn't had lunch, so the first one I thought about scallops. It made me really hungry. But no, I thought it was a very interesting example when we start talking about public-private partnership with respective roles, because what you're really talking about is very, very much so directed state-led interventions in the economy. And then the question comes, well, what does economic security do with public-private partnerships and needs to cooperate? And I think the example you come with is sort of an outlier of how far this can go, and the need to not go to a state economy, but to in aspects of a very much so a directed economy. And I think what's interesting in this is it's not only the geopolitics of today. It's not only China. It's not rivalry between West and China that is deeply uncomfortable for us as Europeans, and that sits very badly with our DNA. It is also that this idea that what we have used to be saying and thinking is that we want market neutral approaches and policies, and suddenly what we are talking about is something that is very much about interventions in the markets. And of course there are more or less intelligent ways one can do that, but I think we are just starting to experiment with that. I think it's now we have 12 industrial alliances at the EU level. If you look at them into some more detail, which one of my colleagues has, these are pretty weird setups. They're not fully formed and tried and tested across every dimension of their activity and the objectives they need to set and how they should work, etc. So I expect very much that the sort of the public-private dimension is something that requires quite a lot more work at the EU level, and I don't know whether we will get into active supply chain reconstructions and the kind of thing you were calling for earlier when you spoke about Europeans and Japanese actors having the capacity to work together on boycotts, but there you are really talking about a different game altogether. My second comment was actually your question on the distinction between competition and cooperation, because I came out with quite a strong plea for cooperation. Well, I'm not too worried about competition going out or disappearing from the world. I think what we've seen in the past few years is that economic competition will remain extremely fierce. Take the US Inflation Reduction Act. It is a trade and investment war. It is a fight for supply chains, for technologies, for taking that home, taking that to the US. So when I say what's needed is to step away from a competition paradigm in economic security amongst like-minded states, it is precisely to avoid that. These kind of subsidy wars which will make everything more expensive, be it the green transition or our economic security transition. But I even with a relatively friendly Biden administration, what we have not seen around economic security is the development of a low barrier transatlantic space. What we have seen are walls being pulled up, not walls being pulled down. And I think if we're talking about economic security, diversification, well, I think that the first step is very much of diversification is, of course, bringing down impediments to trade. So that's what I'm talking about when I speak about competition, cooperation rather than competition. And then the last point was on where we stand in Europe. What are we strong on, or what are we not doing enough of? And I will very much agree with what the speaker for ASML said. I think we have started working on the protect tools. We haven't quite reached maturity on that. But on the promote side, we are far behind what we should be doing. I wouldn't necessarily pin that down to the capacity or lack of capacity in research in Europe. I think we have still quite a lot of cutting edge research, but what we are really struggling with in Europe, also from an economic security perspective, is bringing that research to the market and scaling. From innovation, build industrial stories that can stand on their own 2 feet in today's international competition. And I think achieving this, and I think it was Romana that spoke about strategic indispensability, managing to build positions of strength today in clean tech, in deep tech, be it quantum or AI or biotech, etc., is an area where we have quite strong or big challenges ahead of us at the EU level. And that sort of brings me back to the money question, because of course you're saying we're not out of money, but we are out of money. We were supposed to have a sovereignty fund put on the table by the Commission ahead of last summer. And there was, of course, we can't only blame the Commission for this, it's very much the member states. But in the end, this became the STEP proposal. The STEP proposal, it was talked about as a couple of billions then. It was nothing close to a sovereignty fund. And in the end, this STEP proposal, also in discussion in Council, has shrunk to virtually nothing. And what it's going to be in the end is going to be some kind of a unit in DG Budge that will do some advising to companies that really need financing to go from 0 to giga, to find their space in this world, to try to look for money elsewhere. And I think we are really short of money in Europe. Not so long ago, a couple of days back, you had this climate investment deficit report that came out. What it says is that we are lacking 400 billion euros a year in climate investments, public and private money. So it's not about public money coming in to crowd out private investment, but we need public money to crowd in private investment. And so we have a 50% gap, be it only in our climate investments. And a lot of that is also about economic security. When we talk about our transition away from fossil fuels, dependency on Russia and so on and so forth, well, we talk about North Sea wind a lot of the time. And the objective is 130 gigawatt by 2030. There's no way we will reach that objective. We are managing currently, it's not only down to investments, of course, it's also down to supplies and increased costs, etc. But we are managing to invest in the critical wind power we need at the third of the rate that we need to be at. And so I think there's a very big discussion, and I think also it's good we have Draghi coming now with his report. He's starting talking about it. I think his message to the finance ministers the other day was, you need to start thinking and be ready to look at how we can put more money on the table. And of course, from a lot of member states, that cannot come from state coffers. That will have to come from EU level borrowing, so some form of successor instrument to the RRF and those kind of things. But I think we must be absolutely clear that economic security, and that's part of the discussion we already have when you start talking about supply chain reconstruction, etc. Want to try to limit it, but economic security will cost money. It will cost a hell of a lot of money. And for the time being, that is not priced in.
All great points. Many thanks, Georg. We will definitely need to vacuum all the money that we can possibly find in state coffers, in institutional investors' accounts, or with the pension funds. Wait and see, that's coming our way right after the elections. But before we get to it, and now Tonami-san is next, but since we have 9 minutes left and I want to finish on time, I would also like to smuggle a question regarding one ideal project for the EU-Japan collaboration on economic security. If you could share your insights. If it's too much of a surprise right now, please make your points and then we will come back to it. But let's make it the last round before we finish. Tonami-san.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to answer your question, but in a round way. I'd like to address the question raised by the lady from the European Commission about research and also about training. So sorry for the representative from the Japanese government, but the Japanese government is horrible at funding and supporting academic research and innovation. Also about make sure that there's academic freedom. So vis-a-vis, in comparison, I think European Union has a long track record of funding very interesting and innovative large-scale projects of various universities in Europe. So, and my university at the University of Tsukuba is more than happy to participate in that kind of practical, but with a lot of room for maneuver that would enhance cooperation between EU and Japan, and also somewhat address economic security in a kind of not so hawkish manner, but in a round way. So I think some kind of a research collaboration fund would be very, very useful for Japanese universities. In fact, it seems that European, I have worked with the UK, British government as well, and they seem to be looking for an area for research collaboration because now in China's kind of out of the discussion. So Japanese universities are more than happy for such proposal. And in it related to that, one of the things that I hear from Japanese businesses that they very much lack a legal knowledge. And this also relates to the kind of a different legal culture between the US and Europe. The United States and the UK tend to have a kind of a common law approach, whereas the European take a civil law approach. And then, for example, GDPR and then a digital DMA and GDA, Japanese stakeholders were kind of caught in between where to go, how close should we go to the American or the European approach. And we don't have a kind of a strong legal culture or legal training culture historically, especially on commercial law. So that would be an interesting kind of entry point for research collaboration, but also has a kind of a training aspect to it. And if I'm not mistaken, our foreign minister Kamigawa mentioned that in relation to the kind of the new security environment Japan is in, one of the things that she would like to promote is the training international legal scholars, which is also something Japan very much is behind, even compared to China. So that would be the area of proposals. So economic security. And last point, sorry, I would like to also support the comments from the colleagues from the industry. I think Japan has been leading the discussion on economic security, but that's only limited to large companies that have the institutional capacity and staff to respond to various changes. But the reality of Japanese economy is 99.7% of all companies and 68.8% of all employees actually work for small, medium enterprises. So how do we make sure that this kind of a black hole that exists also can participate in the discussion and build institutional capacity. On that note, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So we have 3 minutes left. So any potential ideas for the future would have to be also described very briefly, if you could. But Eva and Igata-san, please feel free. No, Igata-san.
Very quickly, we have the Shangri-La dialogue for security issues in East Asia.
Yeah.
You have the Munich conference in Europe. Why don't we have a economic security version of this big conference where everyone gathers, and not just the public sector, but the private sector? So yeah, I think Japan and the EU should collaborate on having a big annual economic security conference in either Tokyo or Brussels.
Okay, brilliant. So we will remember that this idea was first floated at the EPC on the 11th of March, 2024 by Igata-san. And you will be giving the opening speech. Thank you very much. This has been an extremely rich discussion. I will make a couple of conclusions very briefly. I think, first of all, we don't know exactly where we are going. That was my sense throughout the 2 hours that we spent together. It is a journey into the unknown. And all the more so, we need to brace for it. We need to fasten the seatbelts and be as well prepared as we potentially can. Secondly, there will be a new equilibrium, right? It's not like we are unwinding global collaboration to where it all started. There will be a new equilibrium, and I think we have a common interest in making sure that we arrive at that equilibrium rather sooner than later, right? Because otherwise, the costs that Wouter spoke about will become abundantly visible. And lastly, I would say that it is an all-encompassing discussion, and for a good reason. Namely, yes, it is about our domestic policy, and it is about the world out there. I think it was loud and clear argued for by Romana that we need a new type of initiative for the global South, and we need to think about that very urgently. So all in all, thank you so much. I think EU and Japan have a lot to build on in the coming years. And at this conference, do we have a name already? I think we should have a name. We will work on it. That you will open with your keynote speech. I think we will need to seal off a very concrete and tangible agenda of collaboration, because the jury is still out for that. But I think the merit of such a collaboration is beyond doubt. Thank you very much to all the speakers in here and online, and everyone who has come here. We will continue this strategic project on economic security throughout the year. So you will hear from us, and if you're interested in the subject, please get in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.